Hi, everybody. I'm Anna Harvey, the president of the Social Science Research Council, and welcome to the Katz-Nelson Fellow Lecture. This is a very special event for us for two reasons. The first reason, of course, is because our guest today is Esther Duflo, the Abdul Latif Jameel Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics at MIT. And Esther is going to share her thoughts about why social scientists should think more like plumbers. And the second reason is because this lecture series honors Ira Katz-Nelson, who served as the council's president between 2012 and 2017. And Ira's work, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, has always encouraged us to reflect on whether we're using the right methods to answer the questions we're trying to ask. And so it's fitting that today's lecture is precisely in that tradition. So in 2019, Esther received the Nobel Prize in Economics, and I realize I'm shortening the title there. More importantly, at least for our purposes, is that 2 years before that, Esther gave the keynote lecture at the annual meeting of the American Economic Association, which was then published later that year in the American Economic Review, and lots of people, including people outside of economics like myself, read it. And I'm just going to summarize for you what I thought the lecture was saying. And Esther's going to tell you in her own words what she really meant and what she thinks now. But Esther was making the case for social scientists to think more like plumbers and maybe less like scientists or engineers. So the scientist tries to build a theoretical model that captures the key features of some situation, but abstracting away any unnecessary details. And the engineer tries to use that theoretical model to design some optimal policy to realize the best possible outcomes in some situation. But the plumber says, hey, wait a minute, maybe some of those details you abstracted away were actually kind of important. And maybe before you try to build the model or design the policy, maybe you should try to get to know the situation a little bit better, meaning go spend some time with the people in the organizations who will both implement the policy and who will be affected by the policy and talk to them, and more importantly, listen to them, observe, pay attention, and notice, and think about how all these different people and organizations are connected. Think about the pipes and think about the potential leaks in the pipes or the ways in which a policy might fail. And maybe then you can design a policy, but you might be wrong. So be humble and experiment, right? Test your policy, test it rigorously and at scale and using the best causal inference methods that we have. And if it fails, go back to the drawing board and try again. And maybe someday we'll actually be able to write down the theoretical model that captures all the important details and design the optimal policy. But to get there, we're going to need this plumbing work in addition to the science and engineering work. And I think for many of us reading that, certainly for me reading it, it was this very unifying vision for the social sciences, meaning we have all these tools in our toolkit. And oftentimes it seems like we're choosing to specialize in one tool and we go off and we do our work in these little silos. But what Esther was saying is actually we need all the tools applied to the same problem. We need to, either learn all the skills or probably more realistically, we need to work together. And in doing that, we will get farther than we would get if we were working separately in our own little siloed communities. So that's where Esther left us 7 years ago. And we wanted to know if this is still her vision for the social sciences. So we asked her to join us today and share her thoughts on where she stands today. And we're so glad that she agreed to join us. Esther is going to talk for, until about a quarter before the hour. As she's talking, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll save some time at the end for her to answer your questions. And we look forward to hearing what Esther has to say. So with that, Esther, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Anna, for this amazing introduction. In many ways, it was an amazing introduction, first of all, because it was such a nice summary of the lecture I did give 7 years ago, which will mean that I don't need to summarize it. And second of all, because the theme that you cued in terms of the need for collaboration for effective plumbing is very much what I thought I would focus a lot of my remarks today, and I can assure the audience that this was not prearranged as an introduction. So let me share some slides and take it from there. So first of all, thank you so very much for having me talk today, and also for what I understand is a series of lectures on this related issues of how the work that is done in the social sciences can be most effectively used by policymakers. Oops. So let's start with a quote. This is a quote that I cited also in the lecture, but it's worth keeping in mind. I think Keynes kind of maybe had this a very similar idea, although he was comparing us with dentists. If economists could manage to get themselves thought of as humble, competent people on a level with dentists, that would be splendid. And I don't know that we are very good at succeeding in that, but this is definitely where I hope we can go. I have a problem with my... So as a way of introduction, there are, in a sense, two views of policies, caricaturizing just a little bit, and in particular of policies that have to do with a development policy, which is the area that I specialize in. One emphasizes structural reforms, big things first, market reform, openness, common law, independent central bank, and this those might be important issues, but are very much constrained by political economic constraints. They are central to their implementation. It's rare to get an opportunity to change them. Usually that happen in the midst of major upheaval, although that happens from time to time. Another view emphasizes being somewhat opportunistic, more reform than revolution, fix what you can when you can, big or small. One of the reasons is, how do we know it's a big thing rather than a small thing? Do we know what an institution? In Poor Economics with Abhijit Banerjee, we draw the distinction between institution in capital letters and institution in small letters, with institution being in small letters being all of the rules and regulation that makes the said institution work. So for example, if it's democracy, who can actually vote and how is it organized, and can you vote by mail, and do you need an ID, and so on and so forth, type of debates that very much are present even in this country. And those things, there is plenty of research that show that those things are important. They make a difference. They make a difference in who is elected, for example. They make a difference in how they can put their idea into practice or not. And then there is also the question of what you do if you cannot change the big things. So even if you think that reforming the Electoral College is really the one thing to do, what do you do in a context where it's not happening? And another kind of related point is that the willingness to promote or to allow change at a smaller level is often a complex mixture of good intention, including by people who are not necessarily good people. Because in some sense, even populism needs the people to be interested in difference and oversight. So some excellent intention by good people can lead to bad policy because the central problem that had to be addressed wasn't addressed. Increasingly, economists get a chance to be involved in this process of going from intention to action by helping governments design new markets, weighing on policies, weighing on regulations. This goes from school assignment mechanism to auctions, the design of auction, for example, for electricity, the design of emission markets. For example, there is a great collaboration between Michael Greenstone's Rohini Pandey and the Gujarat government on that. Also the design of social policies. So that, of course, fits with the goal and the ethos of JPAL, the lab that I co-funded and I'm still co-directing, which has the goal of translating research into action. But what I've learned so JPAL just turned 20 years, and what I've learned in 20 years of research is that when you go from the big picture to implementing policy, you do need to get the big picture as right as possible, but you also need to get the details right. Why you, as in me, Esther Duflo, or the Economist or JPAL, because, and this is what I had argued in 2017, policymakers are surprisingly not interested in those issues. So you would imagine that they are, that this is their job to do that, but really they don't. And so when something is implemented, an idea is implemented in practice, the detail in the way that it's going to be implemented, either something that is being suggested on the basis of existing or new research, or even what the policymakers were planning to do in the first place, they don't really engage with the details, but then it turns out those details matter a great deal. And I gave a lot of example on that in 2017, which I'm going to skip for today because I want to make sure that I get to some new ideas. But the introduction by Anna again was excellent. But if you are intrigued, maybe you can go and read the paper for the examples I had to give them. So let me still summarize a little bit what I had in mind. So you could think of kind of three kind of people to go from a concept to a realization on the ground. The scientists provide a general framework that guides the design. I'm thinking, say, of a physicist. A lot of economists of physics envy. They would like to have a whole model of the world, if possible. Now, we know it's very difficult because it's already difficult for physicists, but at least physics has laws and economics really doesn't. So that seems to be very difficult to focus just on that. But of course, we need scientists who are going to think theories and give us some idea of what might be important. Now, when you want to go from one of these ideas to a law, to a policy, you need to embed it into a machine. So physics at MIT is mostly a physics and engineering school. So the scientists do their science, and then the engineers take those framework and confront them to real situation. But they do that, and in economics, the equivalent of that is, and in fact, the inspiration for the title of my lecture was Al Roth, who wrote a previous lecture on the economist as engineer. And basically what he was saying is that, okay, we have concepts of, for example, he works mostly on the market design. We have concept of what's important in market design, but they only go so far because the real world is a bit more complicated than what's allowed by the theory. So, for example, one problem that he worked on is the issue of matching resident to position in hospital, because he was asked to change that, and he realized that there is one kind of thorny issue, which is some residents are married, so they would like to be matched in pairs. So that seems to be like a small tweak to do, but it turns out there was no way to handle it in a theoretical framework. So he built like a huge machine that was doing the match, allowing for people to request coordinated matches. That can entirely be done in a lab. So the equivalent of a machine is computers for big models, computational models for engineers, even if we don't fully understand how they work. But then the plumber goes one step further. She takes the machine and tries to fit it to the real world, carefully watches at what happens, and tinkers as needed. So, for example, to go back from the engineering model to the real world, Al Roth also works on a school assignment mechanism. And when you take a school assignment mechanism, we have good theoretical results. we have models that, assignment models, computer models that work in principle. But then when you take them to the real world, it may or may not work. For example, a key desirable property of this model is people should tell what they really want, should not try to be strategic. And all of these systems in principle makes it an optimal policy to not lie, to just say what you want to do. But one of the problems they had in practice is that parents do not believe that this is something that they should not strategize. So parents continue to strategize in a world where they shouldn't strategize. And that really is plumbing, which is, what do you do when people don't behave like the way they are supposed to be behaving optimally? And that's what they are also very interested in now. But when they get interested in those details, that really requires a complete mindset change, because when you go to the field, you have to resolve any number of very practical questions. So going back to the school system, how do you communicate to parents? Will they understand the system? Should you allow them to rank all of the schools they want, or few, because they will lose interest? Should they be a walked on priority, or would it backfire? All of this is questions you have to ask. And if you're an engineer, you know what are the important features of the environment, and you try to design the machine to address them. But as a plumber, you don't have the safety net of this bounded set of assumptions. You must make guesses, and you don't even know what details will turn out to be important. Only the experience will tell you. So there really are two kinds of plumbing issues. So why a plumber? Why the analogy of a plumber? Mainly because the plumber, when they come to your house, they don't see everything. So they will kind of put their best foot forward, but then the world will intervene in the form of whatever is behind the wall that they can't see, and then they'll see whether what they've attempted works, and if it doesn't work, they'll do something else. So that's the analogy with the plumber, and it's kind of plumbers are artisans. They know they have learned something, they know their crafts, and they become progressively better at it. And I think it's a little bit the same thing with anybody who is involved in this type of work, either from the policy side or from the researcher side. There are kind of two big classes of plumbing issues. One are the kind of the design of the tap, which are apparently irrelevant details that might turn out to make a big difference. I gave an example in 2017, which was my one plumbing example about how people were requested to sign up for a program that connected them to drinking water in a house in Morocco, and showed that a complicated sign up was a huge barrier. And then there are other type of issue which are more like piping issues. Those are often large decisions, but not very visible, not very sexy. So, for example, the flow of funds, who are sign-off authority on decisions or on transfer or that kind of things, which also, again, in the real world of policy making, turned out to be very pertinent. So I gave this lecture in 2017, and it had a good reception in the sense that people, maybe as Anna very generously said for herself, found this was a useful way of describing what they were doing or what they were attempting to do or what they should be doing. And a lot of people started using this, either the analogy or simply the objectives as kind of a frame of thinking, and also maybe taking more seriously as an object of research itself, the translation to policy, and not just as something we do because we have to do. So there is some people like Stefano Della Vigna, Elsa Vivalt, etc., who will be talking in this series. There are others. For example, I heard a wonderful talk by a psychologist from NYU, Hiro, talking about his experience, or the experience of his group in getting to framework on preschool and talking to bumping into very much the same type of issues. So what I thought I would do today is to give you two examples of how in more recent years I've kind of applied this plumbing mindset to my own work, and also how I've tried to work with other people who were not necessarily maybe natural born plumber. And one set of those people are cognitive scientists and psychologists with whom I have worked on preschool mathematics. And the other is statisticians with whom I've worked on how to work with many, how to design experiments. But let me give you the details now. So why we need to do that? Well, as I mentioned, policymakers don't think that plumbing matters. There is a great short book by James Scott, Seeing Like the State, which talk about the illusion of high modernism, which is bureaucrats tend to think that they can will the complexity away by saying how people, should be behaving in a given situation, and assume that's what they do. That translates in the language that we used in poor economics, in what we call the 3I of ideology, ignorance, and inertia. So policies are designed in some ideology, in complete ignorance of the reality in the field. And once they're in place, they mostly never go away, because there is a whole, cadre of people whose job it is to keep them in place. And as a result, policies often fail even with good intention. And on the other hand, researchers are more interested in evaluating pure intervention, perhaps because it's more directly applicable to pure science. And today, what I want to do is to talk about how I try to approach the plumbing mindset to the research enterprise with the hope of getting a shovel-ready project to policymakers who may not be interested in the details, with the right details in place. Because they would be incorporated in the research process from the get-go. And of course, that cannot be done without them being very, very closely involved in the research project itself. So let me give you two examples of that. So this, the first example is motivated by the difficulty of policy reform, because it's what I called in the plumbing lecture, policymakers as human. Any intervention will to turn into, from a proof of concept to a program, will have to be implemented by people, and people have a lot of other things that they are thinking about. And sometimes those other things are coming in a way. So one thing that for me has been really has been a very permanent struggle is to go from the proof of concept to a large-scale implementation of a particular program, which is teaching at the right level. So India, like many other countries that are former colonies, have extremely bad performance of the education system. All of the kids are now going to school, which is great, but they are learning very, very little. And one of the reasons is that the curriculum in schools are very demanding, too demanding for most of the kids, because they are inherited from the colonial period. And teachers are required by law to teach the curriculum, regardless of whether the kid can follow or not. So kids are falling behind, and they reach grade 4, grade 5 without having mastered the fundamental. And even when they have mastered the fundamental, they are unable to apply them in real life, because they went so far too fast through this curriculum that they have no idea how this corresponds to the real world. So along with Pratham, a very large NGO in India, we've conducted many experiments in India and elsewhere to show the value of remedial education and teaching at the right level to kind of ameliorate this problem by basically going back to the basics for kids who haven't reached. But when we tried to scale this up, it really took a long time to design a version of the program that was acceptable, because the teachers all thought it sounded great, but their mission, as they understood it, was to complete the curriculum, and so they didn't have time to waste to do remedial education or teaching at the right level, even when it was officially a policy, because there are just too many policies, and they didn't see that policy as the most important one. For them, the curriculum completion was their first job, and anything else was on top. So the plumbing part of this work was to say, well, let's modify a little bit the curriculum when it's implemented by governments in government schools. First of all, by having a protected time in the day, which is only for those type of activities. And second, by making sure that the teacher supervisors are trained and given ownership, such that the teachers understand and get reminded that this is not something that comes from some random NGOs. This is the policy. So the program was carried out properly. It led to increased in test scores, and it's been scaled up in India and elsewhere. But at this point in India, it reached millions of children as opposed to hundreds of millions of children. So it remains difficult to implement everywhere, and there is, ups and downs in terms of accepting this idea, because it goes against the grain of this view that we cannot shortchange children with an easier curriculum. So we can do as much as we can, but it seems that it's a little bit limited. So while not abandoning on that, I've started to think for several years now that maybe we need a complementary approach, which is, if the problem is that kids from poor backgrounds arrive to school lagging behind, and then this kind of lags keep being bigger and bigger over time. We just need to make sure that they don't arrive in school lagging behind, and for that we can use the preschool years, and the preschools or kindergarten first years. So this is how I became interested in preschool curricula. Really a pragmatic answer to a plumbing block that I seem to be unable to fully solve from within the system. So I know nothing about how kids learn. So that's how I thought out my wonderful colleague and co-author Elizabeth Spelke, who is the director of the Child Development Lab at Harvard University. And we wrote a couple of papers, which is basically, you could be described as my turning a pure scientist, who is Liz, wonderful scientist as well, and a lab person, into a plumber, largely. So how did we do that? Well, the reason I sought her out is because I was fascinated by the fundamental science that she was doing, and she was testing in labs in very carefully designed experiment that showed that all of the children in the world, regardless of their environment, regardless of their poverty, have similar intuitive mathematics ability. For example, they can recognize numbers, they can compare numbers, they know something about shapes, and furthermore, those skills can be trained, so you can become better at comparing numbers that are where you just see them in the form of a blob of dots, like here. And finally, there is a correlation, although this was not proven to be a causation, between being good at this when you're a kid and being good at formal school-based mathematics later. So I came to her saying, look, let's design a curriculum that can be implemented in real-world preschools in Delhi, in slums, and see whether we get something out of it, see whether the kids would arrive in school better prepared to cope with the curriculum that is given to them. And she was very enthusiastic to do that, so we started this project. And our first project was successful in some ways and unsuccessful in other ways, and they are interested in both ways are interesting. As a science experiment, it was very successful in the sense that we were able to show that these skills are in fact trainable. You can see the treatment effect of training the kids in math in blue at the first end line, second end line 1 year later, and third end line 3 years later. And what you can see is that they are doing better at math at all of the years. However, both for non-symbolic math and symbolic math. So non-symbolic math, however, this knowledge basically disappears later in life. This doesn't. It's not in the when they reach school. So immediately after this is the non-symbolic skills which are very persistent, but the symbolic skills which are taught in schools are not. As soon as they reach school, they forget whatever gains they had, they don't have them anymore. Of course, we didn't teach symbolic skills, but our hope was that the children would, the intuition that they would gain about what is mathematics would turn out to be pertinent later. And that didn't work. And why that didn't work? That didn't work because of the way that mathematics is taught in school, which is more, especially in early year, learning math facts, reciting multiplication table and the like. So the intuition that they were building through these math games wasn't particularly useful to them. So as science, this was nice. This was in fact published in Science. As policy, this was a failure. So we went back to the drawing board and designed a set of games that was combining non-symbolic and symbolic schemes, saying, okay, if the schools are not going to do this transition between one and the other, then we were going to do it for them. That means spending less time on non-symbolic schemes, but skills, but sometimes on the translation. So we designed these new games, and when we use those games, we get much more successful at both symbolic skills, non-symbolic skills, and math composite, even after the kids have left us. So this is the impact on the math scores, and we have the non-symbolic treatment, the symbolic treatment, and the transition, which is the composite of the two. And you can see that even a year and a half after having left us, they are still doing better in symbolic skills in those treatments. So we were happy with that. This means we have potentially a program, but in order to scale, in order to, for this research to have a fighting chance to influence real children at scale, we needed a program that could be run in primary schools. And that implies doing something very different than the very nice games that the team in the cognitive science lab had designed, which were to be run with a dedicated adult for a small group of kids. We had to be able to run this in one single teacher in a large school. We have to be able to do it in years that are covered by schools. And we had to do it in a way that was at least consistent with the curriculum objectives. So I wrote here very jittery cognitive scientists, because that stressed them out no ends, because they had so much less control about what was being done. And they were saying, but now we don't know, because if it's not run in the right way, maybe it won't help the kids, and then it's actually substitute from whatever else they would be doing, so we might hurt them. And we were like, okay, yeah, maybe, but in order for this to become an intervention, you have to design it in a way that's already, that is warts and all, that is already completely mainstream in the intervention, and you have to relinquish control. And that was the hardest part for them, because they are not used to that. So we did that, and this was very successful in terms of kids learning math, both symbolic and non-symbolic math, both in kindergarten and grade 1. So now we have a program that, even though we tested this still on an experimental basis, not a huge sample, a few hundred schools, but in a way and in a model that is already acceptable by teachers because it was already accepted by teachers, is gels with their objectives, what they are supposed to do anyways, and can be implemented in their own classrooms. So once we have that, then we are in a policy that could be implemented at scale. Now, an intervention that can in principle be done at scale, of course, does not need to take at scale. And that's what we discover with teaching at the right level. It could be done by teachers. They are perfectly capable of doing it, but they generally don't do it. So we were quite aware that there is some plumbing to be had in the policy conversation itself. So there was some positive development that helped us. The first one, unfortunately, is the COVID-19 crisis, which allowed the recognition of a learning crisis. So finally, you could say, oh, well, yeah, in truth, the kids know nothing. It's not our fault, it's because of COVID. And once you acknowledge that there is a problem, you can at least be willing to solve it. Whereas before, they wouldn't recognize that there was an issue. Then after 37 years or 34 years, they finally revised their new education policy in India. And in this, they recognize the importance of early years. So this was the Nipun Bharat, the early years framework, and they set up some targets for the early years, which are well aligned with the math game content. So learning the first few numbers, and even some of the buzzwords they were using were also well aligned. So they emphasized communication, hands-on experience, group learning. So even though this may have been mostly, this kind of high-level thinking as opposed to plumbing, we had a way of basically we had something ready to plug into this general concept. So with JPAL South Asia, we kind of launched into an effort to scale up the kind of scalable up version of the program. Working with NGOs, Pratham, but also others, we developed a way of training NGOs to take over the system, and then progressively transfer the implementation knowledge to the state government to implement in their schools, with the view that eventually this will just be part of an integrated model. And we are helped by the fact that it's not there is a search for content. We are not fighting with another content that we would need to be displaced. And that's the difference between what we were doing before in primary school, where they have a much better sense of what needs to be done. So currently we are involved into a bunch of pilots in different states, and they are still quite small, but those pilots are at least give us a chance to iron all of the next set of plumbing issues, contracting, printing, and all of this good stuff. So with the hope that eventually will kind of fit in. So that's the first example I wanted to give you. So this is how I turned cognitive scientists into plumber. The other set of allies that I've tried to enroll are statisticians or economists who are doing machine learning, who basically are statisticians, to think about to think in a more systematic way about how to use a bunch of different learnings and lessons that are coming from all over the place at us, to be able to tell a policymaker, here is one bundle you could pick. So let me give you the example that I have in mind. And that's just the example, but that's the structure of the problem is much more general than that. The example I have in mind for this, and I use for this application, is the immunization, trying to get parents to immunize their kids. There is a ton of research on that, some of which I've contributed to kind of help parents who are in principle convinced that they should immunize their kids, but in practice never get around to do it. So common instruments are cash or in-kind incentives, which have been evaluated in various contexts and are effective. Another instruments are reminders, very popular, SMS reminders. And then newer to the toolkit is leverage social networks. So either locally influential people or friends or social desirability of an action and so on. So there is a crop of recent research on that. So, people are working, doing their different experiments, trying out things, showing that all of these things might work. But if you're a policymaker, what do you do with all of this knowledge? All of this strategy might improve take-up, but you need to know which strategy is the most effective, give you the largest increase in immunization, which strategy is the most cost-effective, that is, gives you the largest increase per dollar that you spend. And then there are a lot many more subtle questions, which are plumbing questions, which is, okay, you want to give incentive, but how much? How much money should it be? You want to use, send SMS reminders. Do you need to send them to everyone, or can you send them just to a few people? You want to use influencers? How do you pick them? And then what combination of these things should you use? And then who should you target? So all of this becomes, to go from the general ideas, the body of research that's accumulated, to a government thinking seriously, okay, let's do something. Like, they need a policy framework. They can't do with just like a bunch of views. So the typical approach, and that's what we do, for example, is to collect estimates from different papers and put them on a common scale. Campbell Collaborative, Cochrane Review, our own reviews do that. The problem is that the population and intervention vary across studies, which makes them difficult to compare. When you test different intervention, different contexts, you cannot combine them. So the best would be to run a single large-scale RCT in the relevant context before launching into a big reform. So that would be ideal. But if you try to do that, you face an awkward choice because you don't have infinite sample or infinite time, and you might have a lot of options. So how do you deal with that? So one option, which was proposed by David McKenzie from the World Bank, is to say, well, don't just try one thing, best foot forward. Or you could include all the combos, but perhaps you would lose power. In practice, researchers then pool the options ex post, but that can be very misleading because then you're using results to pool the data, and it becomes very hard to interpret the result. So there is a push in the literature space towards going for fewer combos, but it's a bit like assuming the conclusion, like in this picture from the Matrix. You didn't come here to make the choice, you've already made it. You're here to try to understand why you made it. And in a sense, saying you can only test one thing is basically saying that. So how did we try and solve this problem? We worked with the government of Haryana, and very much in this context, they were like, okay, run an experiment and then you tell us what to do to change our immunization policy. So we ran about an experiment in 2,400 villages, but 1,000 where all of the treatment could be implemented. And when we wanted to try incentives, reminder, and social network seeding, but in various doses. So at the end of the day, we had 75 possible unique policy combinations in these 900 villages. And that's too much for just running one regression. So I had this issue. And what I did is that I found out, sought out my colleagues to help me solve these issues, saying how to think about this problem of the 75 treatment. And we came up with an algorithm. You don't need to know the detail of the algorithm, except that it basically makes it possible to do this effort and to select in a way that is, starting from your 75 treatment, to select the few combinations that actually work, and then the best of them all. So it's an algorithm that helps you classify how the bundle should be, basically how the regression should be specified, and then allows you to run lasso, which is a simple linear regression, and basically puts in the it's a technique to put in the trash everything that's not needed, that doesn't seem to be effective, but in a way that is not disciplined and not data driven. So in this instance, what do we find? Well, maybe not so interestingly, what we found is the best is to do everything. To have incentive, although the low level is good, to have SMS reminder, and to have a social network seeding. And that we increase the number of shots by 4 on the basis of very few, so it's of 732, so it's a huge increase. So that's maybe not so surprising that doing everything is the most effective. The most cost-effective, actually, it turns out to be a combination of doing the information treatment plus the incentive plus the reminders, and not to do an incentive. The reason being that incentives are expensive. And that increased immunization by 9% relative to the status quo. So if you want to do the most gain per dollar spent on this program, you could do that. But if you wanted to increase immunization the most, you would do everything. Now, then you have the next problem, which is if you're trying to do everything. So you could say, well, for sure, you want to do the network seeding plus the reminders everywhere. But the most effective policy is not cost effective compared to doing the status quo. So maybe you would want to do it only where it works. And the problem again is, where do you know where it works? So we know, so something that policymakers are always very interested in is the heterogeneity in effects, like who benefits the most. And that's your standard problem of predicting medicine. There are many potential things you could try, and many, how do you know that something is a true one versus a fluke? So what I did again is went to see my statistician friend, and we developed a method that allow you to see whether there is significant heterogeneity, so whether there are people who benefit more from a program than others, based on their observable baseline characteristics, and also to say what are the most important of those characteristics. So you don't have a fully specified predictive treatment for every person, which would be very, very difficult to do without bias, but you have a robust way to classify the type of people who have the largest treatment effect. So for example, what we do is we separate them into just 5 groups. And here you see the treatment effect from the least affected people to the most affected people. And you're learning something very important, which you would not have learned if you didn't go through this exercise, which is that some people get hurt by the program. So some people actually, in some villages, immunization goes down when you provide this combo of incentive, social network, and reminder. And in some set of villages, it goes up a lot. So now you can start thinking about why that happens, which is interesting. But you can also make sure that you're not going to deploy the program where it's not effective. And can you predict it based on characteristic? Well, it turns out, which you can see here in all of these graphs, all of the variables that indicate more immunization to start with have lower treatment effect. So basically, in places where immunization rates was already very high, the treatment are less effective. So I want to point out that there is nothing mechanical in these results. It could have been just the opposite. But it turns out that it's like that. It's the places that already have low immunization that have the largest treatment effect. So that's very nice because it's all aligned. It will be less expensive to do. It will have a larger treatment effect, and it will be redistributive. It's not, you might not always be lucky like that, but in this instance we are lucky. So there can be a very clear policy recommendation of prioritizing those villages with very low immunization rates under the budget. So now that gives you the full policy recommendation of doing the communication treatment everywhere, and doing the expensive treatment only in places where the effects would be the highest. And if you do that, you actually save money per remuneration spent relative to the status quo, even though you distribute incentive to a lot of people. So it's also important from a budget point of view. So let me stop here so we can have time for questions. Economists, social scientists more generally, get the opportunity to help design and actual policies and institutions, which require that we get the science right, that we get the engineering right, and we get the plumbing right. And the plumbing issues are not boring. I tried to give you two examples. I hope I didn't convince you of the opposite, but they often involve core problems of science. I gave you example of statistics and example of psychology, so it's not just economics even, where we have expertise, we have experience as scientists, and there are large consequences. So we should not be shy to engage with those, even if it requires this very pragmatic experimental mindset. If you mean you will make a lot of error, you will have to make decisions without the full backing of science, you have to be willing to backtrack. I do that all the time. And but with this mindset, you will do some good here and now, which is to have a true and positive influence on policies. And sometimes novel and interesting insight and problems emerge, so it can even be interesting for science. So let me stop here. Thank you so much, and I'm available for questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Esther. I was just in Nairobi last week. We have a vaccination research consortium, and one of the things we did was we were splitting people into teams and giving them, some fictionalized scenarios. We had some global health policy folks there too, and asking them to think about building the combinations of interventions, just to kind of walk through the thought experiment, but with some of your research in the back of our mind. Okay, so I have a question. Before we get to all the other questions, I'm taking the privilege of the first question. And Mike, we'll get to as many as we can, but it's fine if we don't get to all the questions. We're going to send them to you afterwards, so you'll get to see them all. So you are largely, I think, speaking. I think the essay originally, and I think this talk too, is really, aimed, at least in the first instance, at the academic research community. So people like us who are employed by universities, which are large, complex organizations. And, we exist also in these ecosystems that have our colleagues at all the other universities and academic journals and funders of research, right? Public science funders and philanthropies. And that's a lot of pipes connecting us all in this academic ecosystem. And what you're encouraging us to do, which I think many of us think, actually based on empirical research, is in fact the right way to do research if we want to have an impact on policy. But what you're encouraging us to do is to spend more time maybe than we otherwise would in the contexts of our research, trying to understand, your point about the preschool project was understanding how education works in the context and what do teachers do and how do they spend their time and what are the details of the policy, and knowing all of those contextual details. And when I think about, like, just take the United States as one example, all of the many municipal and county and state and federal government agencies and all of the universities, I think that there's a very high likelihood that we are underproducing the kind of research that you're talking about, right? All the potential research partnerships that we could be forming. And I'm wondering if maybe we have some problems with our own pipes in terms of leaking out all the potential research partnerships. And just as the preschool example, here you have your colleagues at Harvard who are very happy, in their lab running their experiments, and you come and you're pulling them out of the lab and into this field experimental project. Have you thought at all about our own system of incentives and policies, and information and all of the various other things, and the various tweaks we might make to our own system, and maybe even potentially test those tweaks to encourage more of the kind of research for which you're advocating?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this maybe like all the time in a way because so if you take the example about my psychologist friends, they love it, but they would have been completely incapable of doing it, and not because they're not capable. They are very capable people, but that's not what they've invested their time doing. And I think it's a bit by happenstance that economists turned out to be, uh, you know, become good at running trains on time, just because some of us got into this field and build the infrastructure to do this extraordinarily applied research and then start to talk to governments. And I don't think there is anything in the economic background that predisposed us to do that more than anybody else. But it turns out that we have that expertise now. And when we present jointly with Liz, I always keep saying that I'm the person who keeps the train running on time, and this is very much that. And I don't, for me, that's not humble bragging. It's like really important to keep the trains running on time, and it takes skills. Usually, my colleagues who've never done experiment think that it's, really easy work compared to do thinking theorem, and then they run their first experiment and suddenly they gain a new appreciation of the type of skills that it demands. And then going to work with government is like one more set of issues, including being extraordinarily patient, because things don't go at the pace you want. So what we are trying to do, for example, in the case of the psychologists, is to put them into a network with economists to help them so that they learn how to do it, and the entry barrier a bit lower. What I've done in a lot of my career, and not just me, but Abhijit Banerjee, Michael Kramer, and the whole IPA, Dean Carlin, etc., is create infrastructure and institutions that make it possible because the entry costs for doing that type of things when we started were not. I mean, you have to be really committed and very well supported by your institutions to be able to do that. And now it's much less, because if you want to do something, it's not quite pressing a button, but you'll be supported. And to some extent, these next steps of working with government, also we are trying to build the capacity to support it as well. So that's the first set, and that's kind of what I've devoted most of my academic work on. The other set is the incentive part, what is being rewarded and so on, and that's harder to change. Except I've been editing AAR for many years. We can do it to some extent there, but it's not that you have full control ever. So one of the things that I was trying to explain in my first lecture, and to some extent a little bit today as well, is that actually it's interesting in the sense that a lot of the problems, what I was doing in the LI lecture, the first thing is why we should do it for the world, and then finish by saying why we should do it for science. And that's because that's, in the end, the kind of problems that you discover you would not have discovered, and that can turn back to motivate pure science work. So maybe those problems are just sufficiently more interesting that it's worth it at least to engage. And people who have done so generally don't really come back from it. To take my example of my colleague Parag Patak, who really comes from pure theory, moved to engineering, moved to really working on very bread and butter issues of schools, and not just school assignment, but school quality and the impact of charter schools and so on. That's, once you touch these issues, they are fascinating enough that you're feeling, okay, I'll just continue with them.
Yeah. And I mentioned to you before we started the lecture that that's one thing that we're trying to do with our consortium of universities, is to help more universities figure out the infrastructure precisely, with all kinds of the research administration and and matchmaking and contract management and all of that stuff that they need to provide to help their faculty be able to do more of this kind of work. So we have, like 50 questions in the Q&A. So what we're going to do is we're going to send them all to you. So thank you. Everybody who entered a question, Esther's going to see them all, and maybe you might even get an email from Esther, I don't know, answering your question. So thank you for submitting them. And Esther, thank you very much for taking the time. It was
Thank you,
extremely
and sorry for
illuminating.
speaking too long, so and not leave enough time for questions.
No. Time well spent on everybody's part. Thank you, Esther, and have a great day. Have a great day,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.